Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Mark Honigsbaum, who's a journalist, author, and medical historian. Thanks, Mark, for joining me for this talk.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I mentioned you're a journalist, but you're also a research associate at the University of Zurich Institute for Medical History, and you have a book that's coming out this year, A History of the Great Influenza Pandemics, Death, Panic, and Hysteria, 1830 to 1920.
Yeah.
And you'd written recently, as a journalist, I guess you've written two articles about empathy. It was Barack Obama and the empathy deficit, and that was in The Guardian from the UK magazine.
Mm.
And then the history, you have on the History of Emotions blog, the politics of empathy. So we wanted to kind of just talk about, your articles. And kind of your insights and thoughts about empathy. But you'd start off by asking me about kind of what the Culture of Empathy website is about, or what was it that?
Mm. Yes, no, I'm interested in this project. You seem to have already garnered a lot of wisdom from around the world. So,
Yeah,
uh,
well, I'm really interested in empathy and have seen it as really kind of a positive social value, which is what we wanted to talk about. Because
mm,
from what you were telling me, that you have a little skepticism about empathy and kind of at being a positive social value. And from my experience, I've seen it as the something that is important and
mm,
in society, and just kind of dedicated myself to kind of exploring the topic, interviewing, maybe 150, at least 150 kind of empathy experts from around the world,
yeah.
as well as just, people on the street, and have done all kinds of projects. Like when in the Occupy, when they had the Occupy here in Berkeley, we set up an empathy tent, which was
Right.
for people, from a lot of street people, people with drug addiction and so forth were there, and alcoholism and conflict. And so we set up an empathy tent where people could come and kind of have empathic listening and empathic mediation. And I've been to the Democratic conventions here in California, and to the Republican conventions, to the Tea Party rallies, and just gone just wide, casting a wide net to talk with everybody about the role of empathy in their lives. So,
Okay. Could I ask you a quick question then, because that
sure.
intrigues me? Do you find Tea Party supporters as empathetic as Democrats?
Um, yeah, it was. They were talking about empathy. Like one woman said, yeah, empathy is important. It means walking a mile in another person's moccasins. And then she recounted the story. She said, I remember this vividly. She said we had a Hispanic maid, who her husband left her just before Christmas, and she had her family and children, and we brought her in, into the house, and we kind of gave up buying gifts for ourselves to have gifts for them, to kind of support her and her family. And she felt that was like her having empathy.
Mm.
And there's a lot of other stories like that
Mm.
people were telling about the importance of empathy.
Right.
And even at the Republican convention, when I
Mm.
talk to Republicans there, I know that's something that you're looking at is, with Barack Obama and the empathy deficit, you were looking at.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, so you a few minutes ago you said that you gathered from my article I was skeptical about empathy. I mean, just to be clear, I think if you use empathy in the sense of compassion or the old Victorian idea of sympathy, where it's not simply stepping into another person's shoes, but then acting so as to alleviate their suffering, I'm all for that. I think
Oh,
that's
okay.
great.
Uh-huh.
Um, I suppose the reason I wrote my article is I think that when one starts, there's a sense now in which empathy is used as though it's an intrinsic attribute uh, that we all have thanks to our evolutionary development. Um, And the reason I wrote my article is it seems to me that that idea of empathy as this sort of pro-social attribute that's kind of hardwired into our brains through evolution comes unstuck rather when you start to look at the way the term is used in the political sphere. So to take your Tea Party supporter, she would say she has. I take it says she has just as much empathy as you know, some of the liberal or Democrat persuasion. But it seems to me that there's absolutely no empathy for Barack Obama himself. So here we have Barack Obama reaching out and using this term in a rhetorical sense in the political sphere. But it seems to me that when he uses empathy, he's using it as a political lever, and in a way that people on the other side of the political spectrum absolutely reject. So I think what's interesting about that is that it points to some of the, I don't want to say mistakes exactly, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think we have to be a lot more careful about what it is we're really talking about when we use this term.
Okay, so and you'd gone into kind of the history of the word empathy, and I guess what you're saying is that the word is used differently, and there's kind of like different definitions of it. So you need to kind of be more careful about like what
Yeah,
are we really saying here? What is
well, yeah, exactly. So
uh,
there's this great device on Google called the Google Ngram, where you can search for key terms over the last 200 years. And if you put in the word empathy, you'll see that it's not mentioned before about 1905. And then there's a steady rise in the number of hits for the term empathy, which shows how it's caught on. So I'm not the first person to have done this by any means. There are historians of science and medicine and technology who have looked far more deeply into it. But the term emerges around the turn of the century, and it's derived, well known from the German term Einfühlung, meaning feeling into. And it was really, originally, it was invoked as in the aesthetic realm to describe the response that a viewer had to a work of art. An Einfühlung was the idea of feeling into. It was a kind of a projection that the viewer had into this natural object and the kind of involuntary feelings, kind of reflexes. It was seen that you could look at a beautiful work of art and the aesthetic beauty would lead to this sort of kinesthetic response that you could actually, if you were standing next to someone in an art gallery at that time, you might actually see it embodied in the movements of their facial muscles. One person who took up these ideas very strongly in England was, I just want to get her name correct here. Where is it? Yeah, she was an early student of aesthetics, Vernon Lee. You know, she had read the sort of German literature on Einfühlung and the early psychological literature, and you know, tried to study it in people that she knew. But even early on in the use of this term, you can already start to see how there are two senses, and really in which empathy is being used. There's this pure original sense in which it's simply a projection.
mm-hmm.
And then there's something else that happens, which is a kind of sympathetic response. So there's the idea that you project yourself into this object. But then the question becomes, does the object project itself into you, or are you just seeing a reflection of yourself in that?
So this is like you're seeing an artwork. You have a painting, you're looking at the artwork, and it's kind of like your emotions are going into, you're putting your emotions into that painting. It's kind of like this is how it was originally done, but then there's kind of this quality of, is there something coming back?
Well,
this
was the key issue that was debated at that time. But the point I really want to make is the core idea was that it was almost an automatic reflex. response that you had as a result of this process of projection. Um, so with something that was an aesthetically beautiful work of art, you didn't have to work that hard for it to happen. It would happen almost in a kind of natural, spontaneous way. And I think that idea, it has, you can trace that through to the current neuroscience, where that sort of idea of almost a sort of reflex response of our motor neuron, mirror neurons, is detained. But there's also the other side, which is the psychology, the psychological side. Because, of course, when you project into something and it elicits a response, the question then becomes, are you responding to something other outside of yourself, or are you just simply seeing yourself in that object? In other words, is it an egoistic response, or is it a truly other regarding and hence moral response? And that's the question I think I'm interested in more than anything.
Oh, okay. So it's whether it's if you're it's kind of like, is it just about you and your projections, or is there really some kind of a interaction
Yeah.
going on, or
So,
a feeling of the other person or
yeah.
object?
So, I mean, projecting yourself into something isn't necessarily going to result in compassionate, loving behavior. After all, if you project yourself into, say, an Islamic terrorist who's plotting to sort of murder millions of Americans, you might actually not feel empathy at all. You might feel another emotion such as hatred or disgust, right? Because what's important in the process is what you bring of yourself to that projection. If you're projecting your own prejudices, those are just going to be reflected back onto you by
Oh, I
this
see.
process feeling into. So I suppose these are the questions I have about whether promoting empathy in and of itself is going to result in building a more moral and compassionate world, which I take it as the project that you're embarked on.
Yeah. It's when at I mean, overall you're talking about what is the definition of empathy, it seems, and then how does it work? And from my exploration, of the theme of empathy, the word is used in so many different ways. There's people like Dan Batson who's been studying this for, I don't know, 30 years or something, and he came up with 8 different ways at least that the
Yeah,
word is used.
right.
And there's a lot of these subtleties that you're talking about. Is it projecting yourself into? Is it, the other person, you're reading what they're doing. So it's kind of all over the place. So it is a little bit of a difficult concept or term because of that lack of clarity. But
Mm.
then I've been noticing that tends to be with all terms. Give me. There's a book out. There's a like the term freedom. There's a whole book out by George Lakoff on whose freedom, right? And if you look into the word freedom, it's just as big of a mess as. So
Right.
there's kind of that problem we have
Yeah,
too.
but the key difference, obviously, I mean, I don't, I take your point about the way different terms are used or misused, but there is a fundamental difference, and that is this assertion that empathy is an emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, freedom might be associated with certain emotions, but nobody would say that freedom is an emotion in and of itself. But that assertion is made now in relation to empathy, certainly by social psychologists. And I think that's slightly problematic. So clearly there's good evidence that there is a feeling associated with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
But is it a fully fledged emotion, or is it more of a process that can engender other emotions?
Mm-hmm.
Some positive, some perhaps negative. It seems to me that in the original sense, and certainly in the psychiatric sense, in which empathy is used as transference, it's the idea of a transference of feeling. So, for instance, if you learn that tomorrow someone very close to you has died, and that that person's grieving, you might feel their grief very strongly. You get a transference of that emotion. So that's a form of empathy. but you wouldn't. I mean, would you say you feel? I mean, there's an open question. Are you feeling their grief, or are you yourself just? There's all sorts of questions one then has
Hmm.
about what it is that is going on. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that because, I'm not a psychiatrist and um, uh, I couldn't tell you what exactly is going on in the brain at that point. But I think there are philosophical definitional differences. Um, but certainly, this assertion now that empathy is an emotion, just in the way that anger, disgust, love, fear have long been recognized as emotions. Um, the problem with that, of course, is that it's entangled with all sorts of other emotions like sympathy and pity, which we can show historically have had very different constructions over time, right? So the Greek notion of pity, which is this idea of compassion, being moved by another person's suffering to compassionate action. But pity was only felt by the Greeks if you thought someone's suffering was unjustified, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
If they didn't deserve your pity, then there wasn't any empathic sort of exchange that went on. They deserved what they got because they just deserved it. But I take it that now the way in which empathy is used is broader than that. We wouldn't want to exclude people who had necessarily brought their suffering upon them. I mean, certainly religious teachers in the Christian tradition throughout history have taught that you should have empathy for all mankind, whatever their history, right?
Well, since we're talking about definitions, and I've been trying to make sense of these definitions as well, perhaps I could just lay out how I use the term,
Okay.
and then we could maybe kind of map that onto kind of your insights about it. So I'm actually seeing, I call it the wheel and feel of empathy. So the wheel is kind of like the model of empathy, which is kind of a four parts to it. It's kind of like a process, which is the first part is self-empathy. So that's awareness of what's going on inside of ourselves, our own felt experience, sensation of feeling. Like if we just sit here now and take a moment to feel our own bodies, we can have different sensations within our body. And it's the attunement or awareness of that, the first part, self-empathy. The second part would be a mirrored empathy, which is through mirror neurons that, as I'm waving my hand, your mirror neurons are firing as if you're waving your hand. I'm seeing you nod your head and kind of acknowledgement, and I can feel that sense of acknowledgement. So that's sort of a mirror neuron kind of part to it. And the more aware I am of my own feelings, the better I am able to read your feelings as well through that, through mirror neurons. The third part is an imaginative empathy, which is that we can is kind of perspective taking, or scientists are calling it cognitive empathy, that we can kind of put ourselves into the shoes of someone else through kind of a role taking and seeing their perspective. And that seems to come from a sense of self-awareness. At a certain age, children start recognizing themselves in the mirror, and they can start seeing that they have a different perspective than the other person does. And there's some tests, for that. And then there's a fourth part, which is I'm kind of using the word empathic arising or empathic creativity, empathic action. That as we connect with each other at these different levels, that there's a sense of taking an action out of that connection that we have. So if I do it like a freestyle dance, and it's like very emotional, it's a lot of fun, and we're kind of riffing off of each other, and we're really reading each other, and we're kind of being playful, and adding different kind of motions and so forth. So that's kind of the empathic creativity part of it, because we're kind of playing off of each other's emotions and feelings. And then for me, compassion is the same parallel steps, except it's directed towards the sense of suffering. So compassion is that slice of the human experience of empathy applied to suffering. And then, that usually with suffering, and when you empathize with someone that's suffering and have compassion, you're wanting to alleviate the suffering, and maybe, and it's often done through consoling or something like that.
Mm.
So that's the basic framework that I'm using. So I'm wondering how that kind of resonates and sounds to you, or
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting framework. I mean, what I was thinking when you in the first two definitions you were laying out, it seemed to me that you could just as easily just replace the word empathy with feeling, because essentially I don't see that empathy adds anything to that explanation. I mean, we're embodied, we're a mind, but we're embodied minds. So we are feeling persons. Feeling is a part of how we experience the world and how we make sense of the world to ourselves. Where you make the transition from the feeling or mirroring, as you put it, aspect of empathy to the cognitive perspective taking side, that's where I think the debate becomes interesting, because it seems to me that that's where the real sort of political dynamic of, that's where the questions get hard, because what you're doing is you're actually, what moral philosophers would have said is you're taking a cognitive view of the world, and you're taking a particular political view of the world, because it's not enough simply to want, for the sort of empathy that you're talking about, for it to go further than just sort of a kind of reflex response to somebody else's suffering. You actually want to make a difference to that person, and you want to help change their condition so they're no longer suffering. And that seems to me that requires more than just having this kind of vague feeling of connection or sympathy with them on a sort of physical level. It also requires having some deliberative, thought out cognitive project, and essentially a moral project about how you are going to go about changing or helping to change their condition. And this, for me, is where a lot of the sort of rhetoric around empathy really breaks down, because it seems to me if you follow through the sort of scientist definition of empathy that's floating around now as this sort of pro-social tendency, you have to ask, well, how can you both hold a sort of individualistic, for want of a better word, right-wing view of the world, and also, how can empathy apply equally to people who have liberal progressive views and people who believe in a very different model of social change, which is essentially empowering the individual to help themselves. So I think a lot of it then comes down to other moral values, which, the question then becomes, well, are all these other moral values equally, can you both have empathy and have all these other moral values at the same time? Or when you're talking about empathy, are you talking about some intrinsic moral characteristics that go along with that? Okay.
Well, let me see if I'm hearing this
Yeah.
now. What you're saying is that part where we get into the kind of the cognitive empathy or the perspective taking, that's kind of where things kind of get problematic. And part of that seems to be that we have social structures. Maybe are you saying that it's like, you have to, if we have to work together, we have to kind of create these social structures, and that's kind of like the problem area is around creating those structures, or am I kind of misunderstanding that?
Essentially what I'm saying is that, as I said earlier, I mean, if I see someone who's on welfare, right, I might empathize with, the fact that they don't have much heating in their house, that they're poorly dressed and they can't afford much food. But if I learn, that they'd been on welfare for years, they made no effort to find a job, and I have a particular sort of moral view about what they should be doing and haven't been doing, then my empathy might dissipate very quickly. On the other hand, I could take the view that, they haven't had as many life chances as the next person. Maybe they didn't have a good education, a poor upbringing, and therefore they're not as able to help themselves as other people. I mean, my point simply is, it's an obvious one, that empathy, in the sense of moving us to compassion and actually improving the world, can only take place if you take a political view about these others who you're empathizing with. Otherwise, all that's going on is you're going to be projecting your own prejudices and points of view into those individuals. I think that the question, see, it comes out of the fundamental question, is empathy in and of itself going to lead you to behave in the way these great religious figures throughout history have behaved? Okay. So, if we believe the stories about Jesus, he gave away all his worldly goods. He preached a kind of socialistic philosophy, right? My question to you is, do you think it makes a difference what your political perspective is in relation to having these empathetic responses?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a Christian evangelical conservative, family
You're a
initially.
good
So
person.
then what?
You're a good person to ask.
Yeah, I'm really a good person to ask because then I spent like 10 years traveling around the world, and I'd say I kind of moved to the progressive side.
Okay.
And, I was kind of more in that area. But now I've actually moved to another position. I call it the empathy party movement. So it's like, so I'm kind of like, I kind of see that we need what I call a culture of empathy, is so that all sides empathize with each other, and that empathy kind of becomes the primary social value within society,
Mm.
and that we should need to foster that value. And
Yeah, you see, but I think we have to be careful because you're talking as though empathy in and of itself is always going to lead us to make good moral decisions.
uh-huh,
Okay. But I can give you plenty of examples of where being empathetic can lead us astray from a moral point of view.
uh-huh.
Okay. I
Well,
mean, a
yeah,
very simple example would be there are lots of cases of what we call white collar crime, where sort of, middle class Enron type fraudsters are on trial. And, judges often don't give them as severe sentences as defendants who don't share their social background. So the judge might be in that case recognizing the other someone like himself and deciding to give that person a lighter sentence. Very few of us would say that that was the morally correct thing to do. On the contrary, especially after this period we've just lived through of wide-scale financial fraud, which visited misery on millions of Americans, you'd really want to throw the book at white-collar criminals, right?
uh-huh. Well,
Um,
here, yeah. So what you're saying is that there's a judge, and then there's, if there's a defendant is just a, blue collar or kind of off the street, does some crime, that they get a harsh sentence, and our jails are full of that, right? In the United States. And then if it's a white collar crime, someone that's more similar to the judge, in terms of social standing, that they're going to be more lenient to them. And there's like a lack of fairness within that. It's like one.
well, what I'm saying is that the example I gave you there is an example where this empathy that you want to promote has, I would argue, led the judge astray.
Uh-huh.
It's caused the judge to act in a way that is not the moral action we'd like to see. I mean, another example, another very simple example would be, do you remember the video last year about the Ugandan warlord
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Kony that
Right.
went viral on YouTube? It was a very well-meaning video by this charity Invisible Children. They wanted to draw attention to these horrific crimes that have been visited on children in Uganda by during the civil war. Um, and as a result of that video, school children all over America and indeed, England and Europe starting let's get Coney campaigns. So you could say, well, from nowhere, that created empathy on a wide scale for the child victims of Coney's murders in Uganda. Okay. But there was then an immediate criticism that was these events took place, 5 years before. Was a historical problem. Yes, there are some child victims, but if you look at issues in Africa where there's much wider suffering, then what you should be doing is donating money to people, to victims of malaria and HIV and tuberculosis. That's where the empathy would have been better placed, not on creating this rather false disgust, if you like, for this Ugandan warlord who's on the run anyway. So that's another example, I would say, where this perspective taking, which can be for the good, I agree, it can be, morally positive, can also lead kind of people to sort of focus on the wrong target. So much better that you say, well, let's focus on the real causes of misery and despair in Africa. Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like there's these momentary outpourings of emotion towards this warlord and this story, and then it kind of just fizzles away, and not much has really been kind of accomplished or something. So it's not a consistent, it's not a consistent and systematic and effective problem solving.
This comes back. This comes back to my point about the original point we were discussing at the beginning. When you look at the history of the term, and you can see that there's always been this tension between the act of projection and then the more deliberative, cognitive sides of the empathy equation, if I can put it that way. Okay, and we're now in this moment where we have social psychologists and social neuroscience applying this sort of evolutionary pro-social model to our physiologies and our brains. And at the same time, we have the internet and social networks, which seem to be kind of mirroring this idea on a global scale. And I think we have to be careful of this rather naive faith that somehow simply the fact that we have all these wonderful media that allow us to make connections and communicate with people on the other side of the world and be exposed to people, beliefs, and information that in other periods in history we simply would have been ignorant about. Okay, I think we have to be careful to think that in and of itself is somehow going to lead to an explosion of empathy in the sense of compassion. Okay. So, I think it's important to be clear. That's why I would rather be clear that when we're talking about certain types of empathy, it would be better to use the word compassion or humanitarianism, which was the older political term going back to sort of the middle of the middle of the 19th century. Okay.
So you're saying there's this kind of this wave of about empathy. It's like everybody's getting kind of excited about it. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, and that sorry.
There's a kind of empathy bandwagon.
Empathy bandwagon. It's like, well, let's slow down the bandwagon and let's kind of look at this and be a bit more reasoned about it and really kind of look at kind of what's going on here. And let's not let the bandwagon kind of get too carried away or something.
Well, I would really like to ask. To take a really extreme example, and some of the examples I used in my article, is it seems to me that empathy can't just be this thing that's always there in the background, humming away, just rely on to be switched on the whole time. Because there are plenty of examples in history where empathy gets switched off. Okay, and you'll know this from talking to other people in your series, such as Simon Baron-Cohen. So, you know, he's studied what are the, you know, what sort of nurturing do you need to have as a baby in order for you to develop this sort of, you know, this capacity for empathy. We also know that, you know, there are famous cases from neurology where parts of the brain get damaged and people appear to lose their empathy, okay, in inverted commas. But we also know that people who want to carry out specific political acts have been very good at switching off their empathy in order to carry through those murderous actions. After all, I mean, one isn't, if empathy is a universal trait, then the hijackers on 9/11 must have had empathy as much as you or I had empathy. But they still chose to carry through an attack where they knew that, you know, hundreds of or thousands of people would die.
Mm-hmm. So it's that empathy, there's the ability to turn off empathy. I mean, it can be on or off in that sense. And then there's a wide variety of situations. You're talking about the hijackers who were, I mean, they've turned off their empathy towards all the victims there on 9/11, or you could even see the concentration camps where, I mean, the guards are like totally turning off their empathy. They might go home and have their loving families and, you know, pet their dog and love their dog and kids and wife or whatever, but then they go and, on the other hand, and turn their empathy off. So there's kind of like there could be a selectivity to it as well.
Hitler had tremendous empathy for his pet dog, but none whatsoever for Jews. That's the best example I can give, okay? You know, I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, you talk about the power of empathy. I don't think we can be, we should be sanguine about this power. I think, you know, that the greatest lesson of all, which was the Holocaust, showed that the vast majority of people were willing to go along with the Nazis and ignore the suffering of, you know, bystanders, their neighbors who happen to be Jews. Very, very few people actually decided that they weren't going to do that and they were going to go against the flow. And that, you know, they were going to endanger themselves and go out of their way to help people. All right. And we know who those people are now because there's been a tremendous effort since the war to, you know, to honor the memory of people like Oskar Schindler, right? And other righteous Gentiles who weren't prepared to stand by. You know, they made that decision, as you put it, to step into the shoes of someone who was made to seem foreign and other to themselves, which is what the Nazis did. The Nazis' whole project was to make Jews seem like not part of the human race, you know, inhumane. That's how Hitler was able to feel more empathy for his dog, because he had more of a connection with his dog than he had with, you know, with members of the Jewish religion. You know, there was a systematic political project to dehumanize those people. So I don't think empathy is enough.
Well, it's just like Rwanda.
Has to be people have to, in order for empathy to work and mean anything, the empathizer has to take a moral stance, right? And that is something that comes from all sorts of things. One's education, one's upbringing, but essentially what political beliefs and moral beliefs you hold about the world.
So you're thinking that you need a kind of a cognitive moral framework to act, some kind of a philosophy of how to act and operate from that philosophy, or that construct, or
that can come out of, and that can come out of lots of traditions. It could come out of the Buddhist tradition, but it can also come out of the Christian tradition. So during the war, there were Catholic priests and nuns who sheltered Jews in France and Belgium, right? And went out of their way to protect them from the Nazis. But there were others who didn't, and others who gave them away. So what I'm saying is that having a particular point of view can help you uh, to act more compassionately, but it's not necessarily a guarantee.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, there's a very wide spectrum of political points of view within any traditional culture, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
even Nazism was a political structure and political framework that was geared towards dehumanization. So it seems that, I mean, it's like you can have a philosophy that's kind of pro-human, pro-social, and then a philosophy that's dehumanizing. But they're both philosophies or both social constructs. Or
you see, what's interesting to me about the way the empathy deficit is why does he use the word empathy? Because it's kind of become this sort of science has kind of made it this kind of neutral term. Okay, so when he's invoking the empathy deficit, it's like, okay, how can I reach over to those guys in the Tea Party who don't want to sort of work with me on solving the federal deficit or solving these intractable issues like gun crime, gun murders in America. Maybe by appealing to their empathy and their compassion, I can do that. But the problem with that is that as soon as you come down to specific issues, you see that people have, depending on a person's political point of view, they'll have completely different uh, um, uh, social areas in which they're prepared to extend empathy, right? So, Republicans will be, or people from a sort of evangelical Christian movement have been great, for instance, in extending empathy to children in Africa suffering malaria, right? They raised huge, under President Bush, there was a huge presidential project to donate funds and money to people suffering malaria in Africa. That was seen very much as a compassionate, charitable project of the right. Okay, but would they extend the same sort of compassion to people on Medicare who weren't able to afford private health insurance? Not if it's going to cost other Americans an increased tax premium. So depending on what other values and perspectives we have, we're not necessarily going to extend empathy to people simply because they're suffering.
mm-hmm. So there's kind of a whole constellation of different values people have, and that those values kind of influence then how
Yeah.
we're going to act and relate to them is what I'm kind of hearing there. Um,
Empathy turned on and off, I would say, uh, uh, for a number of reasons. I mean, as you know, there are two types of empathy, at least the way it's constructed now. There's this affective empathy and there's cognitive empathy. So we know that affective empathy can be damaged if you haven't had the right sort of nurturing as a child, or if your brain gets damaged, or if you suffer something, if you have Asperger's or autism spectrum disorder. But cognitive empathy is something, it seems to me, that's a result of upbringing and cultural and social pressures, right?
well, you're talking about Republicans and Democrats and so forth, and when I went to the Republican convention, they were actually very. I went to the press office there, office, and I said, "Hey, I want to talk to you, kind of interview people here about empathy." And they said, "Oh, great! We always get a bum rap about being heartless, so we really appreciate what you're doing, coming." And they gave me a press pass. And they actually introduced me to people and say, "Oh, talk to this guy," and so there was three young Republicans, kind of doing the fraternity kind of position, and I said, "Well, tell me, what's your most important value?" And the one young guy said, protection. Anyone hurt me and my family, we're going to protect ourselves. And I said, "Oh, so protections." I was really listening, kind of trying to empathize with what's going on. So protection's really important to you. Yeah, we're going to protect our homes. He didn't say guns, but it's kind of like implied. We got our guns to protect our homes. So yeah, protection and security is really important to you. And he said, "Yeah." And so we kept kind of talking. I said, "So what you're worried about is that there's people that are going to come and do you harm, right?" And the people who are going to do you harm are people who aren't empathizing with you, because, your friends empathize with you, they care about you. So what you're concerned about is people who are not empathizing with you, and you're concerned about that, and you're worried about that, and you're a little fearful about that. And he says, yeah, I guess empathy is important. And then, so we kind of kept, talking, and it was like, then the question became, well, if you're worried about people not being empathic, what can we do together to create more empathy in the world, right? So, and then we started this great conversation, and then one of the guys, he pulled out an iPhone, and he said, I got to show you this. A friend of mine, he was like a total jerk, self-centered, selfish, just thinking about himself. And his mother was dying of cancer. And she wrote him a letter, and it was like one of the last things she wrote to him. And I have a copy of it here on my iPhone, and I'd like to read it to you. And he kind of it was a short letter. It said, "Son, it's so important that you think about other people. You'll see in life that that's really what matters, to in life." And he read the whole thing to me, and then he said, this changed my friend's life. He's turned into a different person. His mother died of cancer. I mean, that was a big shock to him. But then it was kind of her last words that, she just told him about the importance of caring and thinking about others. And so anyway, I guess what I want to say is that, this is kind of like a narrative of, somebody saying that, protection's important to them. And that's a very conservative, the whole thing with guns, you got to protect yourself, but it's really protecting yourself against people who you feel are not going to be empathic, and to actually to speak to that and, work together to foster empathy. How do we kind of, empathy can be turned on and off by fear, right? You want to protect yourself, but how do we kind of create a culture where there is more empathy in general? I guess that's the kind of the approach that I'm taking. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I don't know the answer to your question, but I suspect that it might have more to do with education than this kind of vague idea of just, throwing more empathy out there. And,
So teach empathy in the education system, or
no,
or
I think that what you're talking about is much more. I think that if people are educated and they know about history, and they have a better understanding of why it is they hold the beliefs and views they have. After all, it's not enough. You can't simply ask people to step outside of their upbringing and culture, because people only know what they've been brought up to know. You said you've been able to travel widely. Many Americans haven't traveled outside their own state, right? One of the great things about education is it does expose you to other ideas, other points of view, and most importantly, people from other classes and cultures, right? So, and you travel outside your state if you're lucky enough to go to, a top university in California or on the East Coast, right? So I'd be much more interested in what sort of political and social system would lead to more people having the opportunity to become better informed, better educated. Okay. I think that would do more than anything to reduce I don't want to say the empathy deficit, I want to say differences in point of view. After all, how is it that something like, I don't know, 40% of Americans now can believe that Darwinism isn't a fact? That, how can people still believe in the creation story when we've had facts available to us since the Victorian times which show the Earth is much wider? That can only come about by having people step outside their narrow religious and educational upbringing and being exposed to ideas and philosophies from other parts of the world and other people.
So it's education, kind of being able to take all those different perspectives, kind of see. I guess that's sort of perspective taking. You know, just seeing what other people have said
But
about the world.
it's not
No.
perspective taking for its own sake, which is where I feel this idea of empathy is really rather empty of real meaning. Um, it has it has to be informed, and it has to be an active, deliberative process. Okay, and you know, I think that where it's interesting is that yes, I mean, certainly our feelings can be a guide. Okay, but they can only guide us to moral action so far. We then have to balance them with reflection and giving due consideration and thinking through the consequences of what we do and how we do it.
So it's kind of like that reasoning. It's like there's kind of like emotions, and that we need to have reasoning to kind of reason our way
Yeah.
through the emotions, or to be able to kind of balance them and look at them. And I'm just trying to see if I get what you're saying.
I suppose what I'm trying to say is for emotions to be more than feelings, to be more than mere feelings, more, reflexes, then we have to take a moral point of view. For emotions to mean anything, they have to be political at the end of the day. Okay. After all, if you're disgusted with something, it gives you a moral point of view about the object of your disgust, right? So
Yeah. Okay.
disgusted by something, it's not simply this feeling of distaste. You also then take a moral point of view. You avoid that thing or person, right?
Yeah, it's like conservatives often disgusted by homosexuality, right? There's like a visceral, like, oh, this is so terrible. This is, I mean, the most extreme. It's like, oh, this is like bestiality or something. It's like
Yeah.
they're just like totally kind of
Or,
set off by it.
or to take a maybe a slightly less controversial example, why are we disgusted by fat people? Or why are many of us disgusted by fat people? I'm not saying I am, but there were at certain times in history, having a large corpulent body was seen as a sign of breeding, something to be
Hmm.
admired.
Yeah,
Okay,
so disgust 1 minute you're disgusted, and then it changes, and then in another, or in
you,
another culture, it's like a value. Yeah.
you
Uh-huh.
show that the objects of very many emotions have changed through time. So what that tells me is there's nothing fixed or universal about empathy or indeed any other emotion. I mean, there may well be core feelings, uh, a defining core to each of those there's things we call emotions. But they're also something more than that. And that something more is a result of what thoughts and beliefs we bring to those feelings. And
But
that to me seems to be a result of culture, education, and also increasingly politics.
mm, well, for me, I kind of see empathy as the feeling into the experience of someone else. And just that, in our family Christmas dinner, just, an argument started up between two family members, and it was going to be, I thought the whole thing was going to blow up. But I actually did some mediation. I said, and I was a little scared about it because it was getting so intense with a little bit of, hollering and yelling and so forth. And so what I found is that, with mediation, it's really about both sides hearing each other kind of in this ongoing dialogue. And what happens is, one person says something and the other person's reacting to it, like, no, I didn't say that. Then, back and forth, and they're kind of arguing. So what I did is first I kind of listened to each person and said, oh, are you saying this? And then they were saying, yeah, yeah, you got it. And then I went to the other person, are you saying this? Just kind of reflecting back, making sure that they felt heard. And then after kind of doing that a while, it kind of took the energy down because people were like so heated because they don't feel heard. And then I kind of turn them to each other and say, now talk to each other. Now, what do you hear the other person say? And they say, well, and it was hard, because they would get triggered and set off with, and I said, no, I heard something different. I heard this. And it took a while, and they started kind of reflecting. And then the rest of the family members came in. We ended up having a whole family empathy circle, right? So there's this whole dialogue. I'm kind of like facilitating this dialogue. And so we actually went from this very heated debate that, my father got up and, was hugging my sister-in-law. And, eventually, it took some time. It took an hour and a half of this, back and forth, round and round. But at the end, it's like everybody kind of heard, they started hearing each other, started feeling their way into the experience of the other, felt like they were heard. There's so much pain in not feeling heard that, and it was like this huge success for me. Like I was like, oh, great, just was able to hold and mediate a conflict like that. So I kind of see that's what I'm seeing is kind of the one part of empathy is that we need to, listen to each other, have that dialogue and kind of feel into the experience of the other. But it's not that it's not a one-way street, that we need a culture of empathy to create an environment where, it's the empathy is the primary social value, that we create a social structure so everybody can feel their way into everyone else's experience because it's an ongoing kind of process. I mean, it never ends. I think Johann Galtung says peace is resolving conflict with empathy, nonviolence and creativity, and it's a never-ending process. So we need to kind of raise the value of empathy to kind of create the environment for that to happen. And we don't have that environment in, you mentioned justice, for example. I mean, the justice system is a competitive, non-empathic environment. I don't even, it's like I'm not even interested in justice because justice is totally unfair, just like you say, So what we need is really empathic, like a justice that's change the whole justice system to an empathy building system. So that's kind of just how I'm kind of looking at it.
Okay, but just to close, because
yeah, you got to go. I'm sorry,
it's getting late here, and my stomach's rumbling. But I think what you're saying is very laudable, and clearly in history there have been we have examples of great empathic individuals, people like Mother Teresa, like Jesus Christ, like Buddha, who did practice the sort of compassion and that active everyday trying to step into another's shoes approach to life. And what I understand from you is you're also trying to put that into action in your own life with your own family. But it's a very, very hard thing to do every day. I mean, you have to be an extraordinary individual and extraordinarily determined because, it's not always easy to do that. And when you were describing the conflicts in your family, I think everyone probably listening to this has a similar experience. There's always those sort of arguments in family and often what gets in the way of empathy then are other emotions, right? People may be talking about specific political issues, but actually they're responding on an emotional level. And other things are overriding that, maybe fear, maybe disgust, maybe their love for some abstract principle like freedom. We're freedom-loving people. But people use that word to mean all sorts of different things, as you pointed out at the beginning. So I just come back to this point that I think that we need more than just, empathy building. Because I don't think that that's going to be possible for enough people to practice on a daily basis, because you have to be really extraordinary and really determined to carry it through. So I think we need other things. We live in a society, there are lots of complicated interactions. We can't all be taking the position of the judge when he sentences someone. We have to delegate responsibilities and duties. That's what living in a democracy is all about. And that's why I am much more interested and concerned with building institutions, having social programs that also engender these sort of more progressive, uh, um, compassionate, let's say, policies.
Hmm.
Um, uh, but I think it's great what you're doing. I think you should continue to do it. I'll try to be more empathic in my own life, but I just think some people are better at it than others. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I really think that some people have greater affective capacities to empathize. Just to close, I'll give you an example. My wife is probably the most empathetic person I know. She works as a sexual health counselor in a hospital in South London, where her job is, to counsel people before they have HIV tests and to tell them, either that, they're clear, which is great news, everyone goes away unhappy, or what's often harder, I've got bad news for you. Um, and she has to live with she's often in a room with another person, and she sees and feels their grief, and she feels it as a transference within her, and it's a very strong and it's very visceral, and there's no mistaking it. And I think that the core idea of empathy, tracing it back, that's what it comes down to. I think that we've all felt it at a certain stage in our life, maybe when someone very close to us has died, and you feel it as kind of like a pain within your own body, okay, and it's that physical, it's that visceral, okay. The challenge is, how can we also engender those sort of feelings for people we've never met and who will never know, on the other side of the world or in completely different walks of lives from ourselves. And I think that's a very, very hard thing for empathy, in the sense of this affective feeling, to do on its own. That's where morality and deliberative, cognitive thinking is also important.
Hmm.
And that's all
Well,
I'll
great.
say.
Yeah, that's great. I love this conversation. And think, for me, to build a culture of empathy, it's having these dialogues and looking at all these different aspects. So I really appreciate that you're joining me for this dialogue, Mark, and maybe
It
we can
was,
continue the conversation at some other point. Kind of even go more deeply into it. So,
yes, well, by all means, let's keep this line open.
okay.
Um, in the meantime, I'll send you a Skype hug. I don't know what it
Okay,
is, but
yeah,
I've heard.
Skype bug. Okay, well, thank you so much. And yeah, then until the next time we pick up the conversation, I'll say
Take care.
bye.